The Healthcare Security Cast is sponsored by 3D Network Technology. Reliability is our core value. Visit www.3dnetworktechnology.com. And by Genetec, delivering security strategies for healthcare. Visit Genetec, that's GENETEC.com. And by the Change Execution Group. Visit 360lifetransformations.com. Before we get into today's show, I want to invite you to connect with the Healthcare Security Cast on a new platform. It's a text-based platform called Community. To join, all you have to do is text my community number, and that number is 647-372-2042. That number again is 647-372-2042. The first message is automated. It's just to get you set up and added into the system. Everything after that will be direct engagement with me. This platform will allow you to stay up to date on everything that we're doing on the Healthcare Security Cast, as well as engage with me one-on-one. Also, as we move forward, there'll be other opportunities to connect with study groups and special interest groups. Your information is kept private, and you can opt out at any time by simply texting STOP. Again, to join, just text JOIN to 647-372-2042. That's 647-372-2042. Right now, text messages can only be received from Canada and the US.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast, the podcast dedicated to healthcare security, safety, and emergency management. If you are involved with a healthcare security program or desire to be, this podcast is for you. Join the conversation as we discuss the issues that matter to healthcare security professionals while leveraging the expertise of healthcare security thought leaders and experts in personal development. And now, here's your host, Brian Hamilton.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast for Tuesday, August the 18th. Today I'm joined by Eddie Sorrells. Eddie, thanks for joining us today.
Ryan, thanks so much for the invitation. Been looking forward to it.
Awesome. Now, I always like to start off by learning a little bit about who I'm speaking with. So I'll pose the question, who is Eddie Sorrells?
Well, Brian, I guess I'd have to go in a couple different directions there, but in a professional sense, I am the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel for DSI Security Services. In my capacity as COO, I oversee the operations of the company. We are currently about 4,000 security officers strong, and we stretch from New York to California. So we've been fortunate to really experience a lot of success the last few years. In my role as the Chief Legal Officer, I deal with all the things this industry can bring. As I'm sure you're aware, that can be very adventurous and varied, but in addition to handling the operations, I also deal with the legal side of the company. So in addition to that, beyond just my professional life at DSI Security, I'm also involved in many security associations. I currently serve as a community vice president, formerly known as a council vice president with ASIS International. I'm a board member for NASCO, the National Security Company Association, and also a member of varied associations such as International Healthcare Safety and Security Association. So beyond just my role at DSI, I try to really be involved in the security industry as a whole.
Awesome. And I've heard some of your presentations, and they're always well received. So again, I'm looking very forward to this as well.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to hear a little bit about your, actually, I won't say a little bit. I'd just like to hear about your journey. I know you started off as a frontline security officer, and now you're a C-level executive. So if you could share your journey, I'd greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I just celebrated my 29th year, not just in the security industry, but with the same company, DSI Security. And as you pointed out, I started out as a security officer. Hard to believe it was 29 years ago, but back in 1991, I was a young person trying to go to college and further my career. I needed a part-time job. So my father knew a local security company through his connections and a family friend. He made a phone call that led to me becoming a security officer at an industrial plant in my hometown. So I started there with no real forethought of being involved in the security industry. To be quite frank, 29 years ago, I wasn't really sure what the security industry was. I'd seen security officers around growing up, but wasn't really sure what the industry consisted of. So my goal back then was just to have a part-time job, continue to go to college. And my father was the local prosecutor and involved in the legal system. So I thought one day I may want to follow in his footsteps. So this security thing is just something to do in the meantime. To make a long story short, I really got entrenched in the industry. I learned a lot. In fact, I tell a lot of colleagues even today that most of what I learned was on that security post, really getting to know what happens at the ground level. But from that position, I was fortunate enough to have opportunities in the company to rise up in supervision, everything from being the training officer at that post up to being in branch management. I grew in my role in the company. And at some point in that journey, really started to figure out maybe this is a career for me because I enjoy the industry, all the different aspects you get to deal with on a day in, day out basis. So once I started to go up through the management ranks, so to speak, I began to think maybe this is my security path. A few years after I got involved in higher levels of management, the legal aspiration was still there. And so I began to think about still furthering my education. I had completed my undergraduate work, and I began to think the legal road may benefit me in this industry. So I decided to go to law school. I went at night, took about 3.5 years to complete. Was quite a journey in itself. I tell people now at my age, I'm not sure I could survive doing that, but back then it was something that I could achieve. So after about 3.5 years, I received my law degree, went forward and took the bar, and then assumed the legal responsibilities at the same company. So getting from that frontline security officer to where I am today, of course, I didn't do it by myself. A lot of people were involved in that success, but what I always tell, whether it's a group of young professionals or just day in, day out colleagues that I have the fortune to speak to, is every point in that journey, I learned something different. And it really benefits me even today. And even being in this industry almost 30 years, I continue to learn. And so that's one of the fortunate things about my journey from security officer to where I am today.
Awesome. Now, you kind of alluded to this in answering that last question, but who were some of those mentors and influencers in your career who helped you get to where you are, and how did they influence you?
That's a great question, Brian. And I think that's one of the most overlooked aspects of anyone's success is those mentors and the people that play a part throughout that journey. And when I think about my mentors, a couple of people come to mind. First of all, my father. I would not be sitting here talking to you today about the security profession or the legal profession without him instilling in me not just a motivation for education. That's one of the things I learned from him throughout my life is always bettering yourself through education. I can remember when I called him when I decided to go and achieve my law degree. One of the things that really concerned me was that I sort of reached an age where maybe that's not quite what you do. I look back at where I'm at now age-wise, and I realized I was still very young at the time, but didn't know it. And I posed that question to him. If I go to law school, I'm going to be this age when I get out. And his advice to me is, well, you're going to be that age regardless, either with or without a law degree. So he was a big mentor in my life, pushing me to better myself, to make sacrifices, to really make sure I achieve the goals that I've set for myself. So he would be a big mentor, especially in the legal realm. He was a district attorney for a number of years. Was in the legal field for all of his career, very well-respected prosecutor. So I learned a lot about the law and the legal system from him. So he would be a great mentor. The second one that comes to mind is Alan Clark, who is the owner of DSI Security. He was the one that hired me those 29 years ago as a security officer. And oftentimes when you hear people tell stories of success, it takes that one person to see something in you don't see in yourself. And that's really what happened to me. I mentioned before that I had no idea 29 years ago that I'd be sitting here today. But Alan saw something in me I didn't see in myself, and he was willing to invest in me to see that I could succeed and really grow with the company. I tell people a lot, I grew as the company grew. My skill set, hopefully my background was more varied, but he really invested a lot in me and still work for him to this day. So it's been a real a blessing over the past 29 years to have both those men in my life as mentors, and they certainly invested in me, and I'm still reaping the benefits today. Beyond that, there's countless people in this industry that have served as mentors, certainly too numerous to mention. And one of the pieces of advice that I give young and old is you need mentors no matter what stage you are in your career. We talk about mentors mainly when it comes to someone who's young in their career, young professionals. 29 years in this business, I still need mentoring. I still need advice. I still need guidance. So through associations, I think about associations such as ASIS International, the International Association of Healthcare Safety and Security, having the ability to pick up the phone and get advice from peers and colleagues is invaluable. Happened to me just this week. I was thinking about taking a step in my volunteer career in one of these associations. Instead of thinking, well, I've got it all figured out, I've been doing this so many years, I picked up the phone and called a colleague and said, give me your advice, give me some guidance, give me some assurance here that I'm making the right decision, or give me some reasons why I'm making the wrong decision. So mentorship should never go away.
And one of the things that you mentioned there that I like to just kind of park on for a second is just the volunteer leadership piece. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement with volunteer leadership and just some of the other benefits that you've been able to gain from that?
Absolutely. You know, it sounds cliche to say that we have a responsibility to give back to the industry that's given us so much, but that's true. So I think one of the first things that motivates me when it comes to volunteer leadership is just hopefully leaving the industry better than I found it. That should be one of the goals we all have in serving in volunteer leadership. Beyond that, one of the invaluable aspects of being involved in these associations, whether it's at a leadership level or just being involved at the membership level, is really learning from peers and being involved in trends that are happening. You know, we're talking during a very uncertain period of time in our history as a planet, much less the industry. And just to be frank, and again, it sounds cliche, but I'm not sure what I would have done without some of those associations being at the forefront of helping the industry get through that. So, and being at a leadership level, whether it's serving as a community vice president with ASIS or being on boards of various associations, or even being just what I call a consumer of information, and that is one benefit of being a member of these associations, is finding out what's going on. And also finding out that you're not in this alone. You know, I talked earlier about my journey from security officer to COO. Associations and education and best practices had a huge impact on that. I mean, that was invaluable. Being able to learn certain things at certain points in my career. I even tell my children today, knowledge is something that can't be taken away from you. If you want to really get somewhere in your chosen field, build your knowledge base, know what's going on. So associations to me are just a huge asset in that realm. And so I would encourage anyone, if you're not a part of association, whether it's in a security field or another field, get plugged in. That's one of the sure ways you can expand your career and expand your knowledge base.
Excellent. One of the things that you alluded to earlier was your legal background. So, and you mentioned also that this is something that you've leveraged to support your security career. So question I have is, how as security leaders in the healthcare industry, can we ensure that we're doing the best that we can to protect our organizations and ourselves from potential litigation?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And of course, that's a concern that every industry grapples with. And being in the security industry and being on the legal side of things, I can tell you that security practitioners have what I call unique concerns when it comes to liability, and specifically when it comes to healthcare and really other areas of security as well. You have certain challenges that are just there. You know, I'm fond of saying sometimes that I get asked the question, can we get sued? And my somewhat flippant answer to that is, we'll stop the question right there. The answer to that is yes, you can get sued for virtually anything under the sun, The real question is, how can you defend yourself when that lawsuit comes? How can you be proactive to hopefully avoid those lawsuits? That's the first goal, but also position yourself to protect your company, your organization, your employees when that litigation comes. So I've been fortunate to see it from all sides. One of the things that I always try to do when I'm speaking to our employees, customers, doing consulting work, I've actually served as an expert witness in various scenarios, as always have to look at that person's perspective. Have they been exposed to all sides of this issue? And so once you start to grapple with that, you understand that every decision that's made could have consequences, good or bad. So how can leaders in healthcare really ensure they're doing the best they can? It really starts with fundamental security principles. A lot of the issues that we face in healthcare security are really a byproduct of the environment. As you know very well, healthcare security is a different animal, a different environment. It's an environment where people are walking into because of stressful situations. When I speak, and I certainly didn't originate this line, but I've used it quite a bit. Unless you're going to a hospital because a child is being born, you're there because it's a very negative experience, usually. So the stress levels are high. So you're tasked with having a safe and secure environment, but at the same time being warm, welcoming, open, and inviting. That can be a very difficult goal to reach. So one of the things that I tell healthcare security leaders when it comes to potential litigation is start off with asking yourself the question, why do I have the security program that I have? How did I come up with the policies and procedures, the training? If I'm using a contract provider, what went into that RFP? Who decided what posts are going to be in this location of the hospital, armed or unarmed? What training criteria is going to be required? So stopping first and asking yourself that question, what is my security program based on? What data am I actually using to come up with these different issues that I'm implementing a solution to? Now, when we talk about litigation, there's various things we could talk about: negligent hiring, negligent supervision, all different manner of lawsuits could come our way. But when it boils down to, we're really talking about negligent security actions, and it varies state to state. But basically, that's litigation that a hospital or healthcare facility or a contract provider could face, where a injured party is basically saying that you had a legal duty to protect me. I'm a patient, I'm a visitor, I'm an employee in certain circumstances, and you had a duty to provide, in this case, adequate security. If I go to your hospital, you have an obligation to make sure you have security that's adequate. Now, you and I could talk for hours about the definition of adequate and reasonable. That those are two legal terms that come up in these cases. But first of all, you had a duty. Second of all, you failed to take reasonable steps to adhere to that duty. So you had an obligation. And second of all, you weren't reasonable in meeting that obligation. Now, again, we could talk about the word reasonable for 2 or 3 more episodes here, but you failed to do that. And what we see a lot is you just didn't have enough security. It wasn't properly stationed. They weren't properly trained. We could talk about lighting. I've seen several cases where cameras were not working in key areas where crimes occurred. So you failed in that obligation to keep me safe and secure. And then next, I suffered because of it. Because of you not taking this obligation seriously and doing what you should have done, I was injured. I was assaulted. I was a victim of a crime, up to and including a wrongful death action. So that's what you're looking at potentially down the road. So when I do consulting work or talk to people about preparing for litigation, you have to sort of look at each one of those and think, how can I answer some of those questions? Now, before I go any further, and this may sound counterintuitive based on everything I've said up to this point, but no security program should be driven by avoiding litigation. That should not be at the forefront of every discussion. Every time you make a security decision, you shouldn't think, wait a minute, how does this fit into fighting lawsuits in the future? Right. However, one flows from the other. I always tell people that are going to be deposed, just talk about the steps that you took and why you took them. and why you thought they were reasonable based on the data you were looking at. So really taking into account, why are we making these decisions? Are they based on valuable data? Are they based on reason? And quite often when I ask that question, people will say, well, we've always had two people on the parking deck because we've always had two people on the parking deck. And now that you asked that, that's just always been in the RFP. We're not real sure why it's not one or three. And we're also not sure why we haven't put someone in the new ER department. And so having those discussions is probably the best proactive measure you can have so you're ready when litigation comes down the road.
Right now, you'd mentioned this is just this portion of it is something that we could fill multiple episodes with. Now, I'm going to ask you a bit of a broad question, and this is again something that we could probably go on with for many episodes. But do you have any best practice recommendations for, I guess, around policies and procedures? I'm just thinking from the perspective of someone who's a manager who's maybe new to either management or new to healthcare. What are some good foundational things to do when you're first starting a program or first taking over a program, as far as making sure you have proper policies and procedures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really starts with that fundamental question. The first thing that I would recommend someone that's just coming in, or by the way, if you've been entrenched in it for years, you should be doing this on an annual basis, really asking yourself this question: is my security program, is my overall plan based on a real solid risk mitigation strategy? And that, of course, can only be accepted if you have a good understanding of your risk. What kind of incidents have happened at this facility in the past? What kind of issues are we facing now? So I would start off by saying, get an understanding of what you're up against, so to speak. We could talk about various healthcare facilities and we could change different attributes of each. And you and I could both say, well, we need different plans at this hospital opposed to that hospital. One of the things that I'm talking to a lot of healthcare security professionals and professionals in other organizations is what we're currently going through with the pandemic. That has changed the risk profile. Think about the healthcare environment. I mentioned earlier about it being very stressful. If I get a call today that I need to go to the hospital because there's a family member there, I consider myself a little bit of a laid back person. My wife may disagree with that, but consider myself pretty easygoing or laid back. But if I got that phone call right now, my stress level would increase. By the time I got to that front door and I was met by a security officer, it may be off the charts. And I would not want to hear about policies and procedures. Have a seat here, you must sign in, you must have a badge. I'd be intent on getting past that door. So that's in normal times. Add to that what we're dealing with now. Having additional screening, or being told you can't proceed beyond that door. So the risk profile has changed just in the past several months. So the advice I would give is understand your risk first. Understand what you're dealing with, and then start to try to mitigate that. It can be as simple as we have a rash of car break-ins in parking lot A. So let's redirect some patrols into parking lot A. Versus parking lot C, or it could be technology these days. How do we invest in technology? It's not all about just armed or unarmed security officers, but leveraging technology. So I would say start with what you're trying to accomplish first. Some of the mistakes that I've seen in litigation is they have all the bells and whistles, so to speak. They've got cameras, they've got this and that, but then you ask, why did you have that? And sometimes there's not a good answer. Well, we had cameras here, but not there, but nobody really knows why. So really understanding what you're trying to achieve before you start to put all the solutions in place.
Right. And I guess now the next thing I'd like to ask about is training. Now, would you take a similar approach to training, or is there anything that you would do differently in that regard?
No, I think some of the same principles apply. Training has to evolve. And one of the most simple things that I've done in my consulting work, but arguably one of the most effective, is whether it's in a hospital or a manufacturing environment, walking up to a nurse, patient care assistant, security officer, et cetera, and just having a conversation, and throughout that conversation saying, oh, by the way, are you aware if this facility has a active shooter or active assailants response program? And sometimes the answer is no, but even when the answer is yes, oh yes, we have a program. My next question is, well, what is your responsibility or what is your process when that happens? I've seen a lot in hospitals when it comes to code. Some use plain language, some use codes, but oftentimes I'll ask, whether it's a security officer or hospital employee, the code's there on your badge, whether it's color coded or signals or whatever. So tell me about that code. And they may say, well, that code means ABC. And then I'll say, well, what do you do when you hear that code? And I ask those questions because that can magnify deficiencies in training. Oftentimes people will say, well, now that you mention it, I'm not real sure. I know what that means, but if an active shooter did come in the ER, I'm not real sure what I'm supposed to do. So taking the approach to training, making sure that not just the security staff is trained, but the hospital and healthcare staff as well, because when these things happen, every person needs to know exactly what he or she is supposed to do. So I would take the same approach to training, backing up and seeing what training do we need to actually achieve. There's certain regulatory issues in hospitals that certainly have to be adhered to. But beyond that, not just checking off boxes, what skill sets do we need to give, not just security, but the employee population as a whole? And so you have to back up and look at that in a very objective way to find out, is that deficient and how do we need to address that?
Excellent. One thing you alluded to earlier as well is, I guess, just some thinking around the number of security guards or security officers that we have in a facility. Now, obviously, there's one metric that we can use. It's a pretty popular one, is square footage. And, I don't know if I'm being a little bit facetious there. That's for a healthcare environment. That's not always the best indicator, but
No.
what are some of the things that we want to tie into to figuring out exactly how many guards are required at, specific posts or throughout the facility?
Yeah, and again, another great question, an issue that comes up a lot in litigation, and I'll sort of circle back a little bit to those words, adequate and reasonable. That those are very subjective words, but carry a lot of legal weight. So I always tell, whether it's our customers or groups that I'm talking to, believe it or not, and I can already hear the people that have been through litigation already doubting what I'm about to say, but believe it or not, you're not held to a standard of perfection. You're not held to an absolute guarantee that nothing will ever happen. And if it does, then that means you have inadequate security. What you are held to as far as a standard is being able to articulate that what you did was reasonable and adequate. So often we get into what I call this numbers game between the plaintiff and the defense about, okay, if you had X amount, you should have had Y amount because this happened. So I've been in a number of depositions, observed a number of depositions where this comes up, and the question is asked, how did you arrive at that number, and also post location? Now, in hospitals, that's even more challenging. You mentioned square footage, and that's an excellent example. Another one is number of entrances. Hospitals are notorious for just many, many points of access. And so as a security practitioner, when I first got involved in healthcare security many years ago, I approached it from a very basic level. Well, access control. We got to control access to this huge hospital. And then you start to back up and say, wait a minute, we got people coming in this door for outpatient surgeries. We got people coming in to the ER here, the front door here, the women's center here. And at the same time, there has to be some free access because people have to get in and see family members and get procedures done. And so from that standpoint, you start to think about, well, how many security officers do I need to actually address what's going on at this facility? That's when you have to fall back into, what risk am I dealing with here? What issues do I have based on my research, based on past events, based on what's going on right now? What do I need to do? And so does that involve having 2 security officers here, 3 there? It's going to vary, certainly by location. I've been asked probably a dozen times, at least in the last couple of years, by different security professionals, do you have a staffing matrix or a standard you would recommend? This many security officers, as you pointed out, square footage wise, or, in this sector or that sector. And much to their disappointment, I have to say there is no magic number. You have to really back up and look at what's required of that facility and take that risk into account. So if you are in the unfortunate situation where you have to explain that decision, going back to my earlier comment, it's not just, well, that's what the RFP said, or we've always had 2 at the parking deck. You can say, well, we thought it was reasonable and adequate to have 3 at the ER as opposed to 4, because we've had 3 for the past 2 years and there's been no past incidents, and we feel like we're mitigating our risk. So that would not have been reasonable or adequate for us to have 4 as opposed to 3. That's a much better answer than, well, 3 just sounded good and we've always had 3. And we could do an entire episode on this, but one of the big no answers is, well, there was only a budget for 3. So we only did
Yes.
3. And if we'd have just had more budget, we'd have done 4, but we only had a budget for 3. No, if 3 were reasonable and adequate and you can justify it, stake your claim on that. Just have the data to back it up.
Oh, fair enough. Now, I know a topic that you've spoken to before is these situations where there's an unexpected but very impactful event, for example, an active shooter. What are some of the recommendations that healthcare security leaders can follow to prepare for an incident and meet the legal requirements?
Yeah, and also a great question. And the simple answer to that, and of course, it's got a lot of different details beyond this, but it's just awareness. Active shooters, unfortunately, have become almost commonplace in the last several years. I can remember very early in my career, I would talk about workplace violence, a term that we still use occasionally, but now we're moving into active shooter, active assailant terminology. And I would put up a slide, and within a slide, maybe 2, I would list pretty much every major active shooter event in the United States. Now that would take multiple slides, and I would be there all day if I try to discuss every event. So it has become almost commonplace. The only, as strange as it sounds, silver lining to that is when I go out and do training now, there seems to be a real interest in finding out more information from non-security professionals, doctors, nurses, ER physicians, et cetera. They're sitting up and taking notice because they know that it is a real threat because of the environment they're in, and not just active shooter, but any active violence in a healthcare setting. So the first thing that I would say is awareness is key. Having that part of the overall emergency management structure, not just in theory or just in policy, but actually in practice. I mentioned before about asking people those questions. That's not to embarrass anybody or to catch them not knowing something they should know. It's really to gauge how effective that awareness and that training is, to really point out, do we need to do a better job here? So first and foremost, having that awareness. We just got through talking about numbers of security officers. If we were to quadruple the staff at every healthcare facility in this country, if not this globe, that still would not be a magic solution to active shooter. It takes training and awareness of the entire healthcare staff. So first and foremost, having that training policy, having that awareness, not having training just to check a box, but training that can be effective. Empowering employees is what I talk about a lot. If you and I were security officers in a very large hospital, and we spent days, if not hours on end, walking the halls of those hospitals, we may or may not find out about threats and concerns, but I can guarantee you the doctors, the nurses, the dietitians, the janitorial staff, et cetera, they're going to know much more than we do. So are they empowered to recognize the warning signs? Do they have the training that's required to actually take some of those things and report it to the proper departments and then take action if they're faced with that? We hear a lot about CPI and some other tools that we use for de-escalation. Those kind of techniques need to be taught, in my opinion, universally at a certain level to all employees in healthcare settings, but also to make sure they understand that they have a obligation to shift it back into litigation a little bit. Whether you're a security officer or just a hospital employee in another department, from a litigation standpoint, if something happens, that's one of the things that's going to be under the microscope. Not only did you have a plan, but did you train on that plan? Did you explain that plan? It doesn't always have to be this large gathering once a year where somebody like me comes in and does a bunch of training with a bunch of bells and whistles. It can be something as simple as a weekly emergency management meeting where someone says, hey, any concerns about potential violence in this hospital? Let's talk about some stories. How do we handle that? I'm a big fan of what I call tabletop scenarios, and not to be confused with tabletop exercises. Just at the conclusion of the meeting, say, hey, if someone came in that ER door right now holding a long weapon, what would we do? And people sometimes chuckle, well, where's the policy? No. If you look up and see that right now, what would we do? And that starts to put all the training in a practical aspect. What would we do? We know there's this big manual on the shelf somewhere, and we get this in our paycheck every now and then, a little training guide, but what would we do? There's a story that I tell sometimes in my training classes. It's been many years ago. I was asking during an assessment and doing some consulting work for a customer, give me all your emergency management policies, your response team, and they actually had done a very good job. They actually had a threat assessment team where they would take threats and actually go through a good methodology of how to address them. Here was the problem. In a very casual conversation going through these policy and procedures, I started to go through the roster, and the person that I was working for leaned over my shoulder and said, oh, wait a minute, that guy's retired. He's actually passed away. I don't think he even works in that department anymore. So the point there was, had a great policy, wonderful procedures, but obviously they weren't keeping them up to date or making sure that people knew about them. So it's great to have policies, but awareness is the biggest key there.
Awesome. Now, we covered quite a bit of really good content here. Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I think, the times that we're living in, I think one of the things that I never want to miss an opportunity to mention is how valuable the security officers are to what we're going through right now, and security professionals such as yourself and so many other people throughout our industry that are really doing great work. It's one of the things that I said early on, that I believe every negative experience has a positive aspect, and it's very, very hard to find that positive aspect in what we've been going through the last several months. But I think one positive aspect is that the work that security professionals are doing is getting some of the recognition that it's long deserved, and especially in healthcare. I think people are seeing, the people in healthcare management have known it for years. Certainly people in security have known it for years, but they are filling a very, very valuable role in a very key sector in our economy and keeping things going in an obvious way here. So I would just point out that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to all the security professionals working in healthcare right now.
Awesome. Now, in terms of yourself, what can we expect to see from you moving forward?
Yeah, looking forward to speaking at GSX Plus. Of course, that's going to be virtual in September here in just a few weeks. We'll be speaking at that. I hope to continue doing some work with different associations. I actually released my first book a couple of years ago about security litigation. So I'm actually looking right now to potentially look at writing another one to sort of continue that study of how we deal with some of the security entanglement with legal issues, and maybe talking about some things beyond the aspects that we've touched on, that there's many different challenges security officers and security professionals face. One of the things in that realm is just dealing with balancing things like First Amendment rights. There's something called First Amendment auditors that, again, we could do an entire episode talking about. But the needs of the security professional, the skill sets that the security officer needs now and in the future are changing dramatically. So hope to do some work in that area and try to contribute any way I can to helping future professionals really achieve those skill sets.
Awesome. Now, as we wrap up, is there a message that you would like to share with the Healthcare Security Cast community?
Yeah, as I said before, my one piece of advice to anyone, regardless of what stage they are in their career, whether it be healthcare security or other security, learn as much as you can. be plugged into these different associations and be mentored regardless of what stage you are in your life and career. You follow those steps, hopefully you'll be successful and learn at each step in your journey.
Excellent. And in closing, how can we connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn, Eddie Sorrells. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook. If you do ASIS Connects, the message board community forum, I'm on there as well. So we welcome anyone to connect, and always looking to have more connections in the industry.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today, Eddie. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody got a lot out of this today.
Thanks so much, Brian. It was a pleasure.
And this concludes another episode of the Healthcare Security Cast. Join us again next week when we're joined by Jordan Mendoza. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so yet, join my text community. All you have to do is text me. Text START to 647-372-2042. That number again is 647-372-2042. Thanks again for joining us, and until next week, stay safe and take care.